This program is based on the works of Harum Yahya. Islam denounces terrorism. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks were made on two major cities in the United States of America. These attacks caused the death and injury of thousands of innocent people. We as Muslims offer our condolences to the American nation. These attacks propel the important issue of the true source of terrorism to the top of the world agenda. Thus, it has been announced to the entire world that Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance that summons individuals to compassion and justice. Leading media organizations, television and radio stations said that true Islam forbids violence. Many world leaders stated that Islam encourages peace between people and between nations. The Western circles that have come to a full grasp of the religion of Islam and are well informed about Islam as commanded by God in the Quran noted clearly that the words Islam and terror cannot stand side by side, and that no divine religion permits violence. This program maintains that the source of the terror that we condemn is definitely not from a divine religion, and that there is no room for terrorism in Islam. This is made clear in the Quran, the main source of Islam, and in the practices of all true Muslim rulers, the Prophet Muhammad being the foremost of them. As is known, for centuries various acts of terrorism have been carried out in different parts of the world. These terrorist attacks were carried out by different groups for a variety of purposes. Sometimes a communist organization, sometimes a fascist group, and sometimes radical and separatist factions assume responsibility for these acts. Countries like America often become the target of attacks by racist and marginal terrorist groups. The European countries have been center stage for violent acts carried out by terrorist groups. 17 November in Greece, Red Army faction and neo-Nazis in Germany, ETA in Spain, Red Brigades in Italy, and many other organizations seek to make their voices heard through terror and violence. Terrorist groups kill innocent and defenseless people. The nature of terrorism changes with changing world conditions and increases its impact and power with the new means made possible by developing technology. In particular, mass communication tools such as the Internet extend the scope and influence of the terrorist activities considerably. Besides the Western organizations, there are also other terror organizations of Middle East origin. Terrorist attacks are carried out by these groups in all corners of the world. Sadly, the fact that the perpetrators of various terrorist acts carry Christian, Muslim, or Jewish identities cause some people to put forward claims which do not concur with divine religions. The truth is that even if terrorists have Muslim identities, the terror they perpetrate cannot be labeled Islamic terror, just as it could not be called Jewish terror if the perpetrators were Jews, or Christian terror if they were Christians. That is because murdering innocent people in the name of a divine religion is unacceptable. We need to keep in mind that among those who were killed in New York and Washington, there were people who loved the Prophet Jesus, Christians, the Prophet Moses, Jews, and the Prophet Muhammad, Muslims. Unless forgiven by God, murdering innocent people is a great sin that leads to torment in hell. No one who is religious and fears God would do such a thing. The aggressors can commit such violence only with the intention of attacking religion itself. It may well be that those who carried out this violence did so to present religion as evil in the eyes of people, to divorce people from religion, and to generate hatred towards those who are religiously inclined. Consequently, every attack on innocent people having a religious facade is actually an attack made against religion. Religion commands love, mercy, and peace. Terror, on the other hand, is the opposite of religion. It is cruel, merciless, and demands bloodshed and misery. This being the case, the origins of a terrorist act should be sought in disbelief rather than in religion. People with a fascist, communist, racist, or materialist outlook on life should be suspected as potential perpetrators. The name or the identity of the triggerman is not important. If he can kill innocent people without blinking an eye, then he is a non-believer, not a believer. He is a murderer with no fear of God, whose main ambition is to shed blood and to cause harm. For this reason, Islamic terror, Jewish terror, or Christian terror are erroneous concepts. The religion of Islam, as well as two other divine religions, can by no means countenance terrorism. On the contrary, terror, that is, murder of innocent people, in Islam is a great sin. Muslims are responsible for preventing these acts and bringing peace and justice to the world. Some of those who say that something is done in the name of religion may in fact misunderstand that religion, and as a result, practice it wrongly. For that reason, it would be wrong to form ideas about that religion by taking these people as an example. The best way of understanding a religion is to study its divine source. Islam's divine source is the Quran, which is based on concepts of morality, love, compassion, humility, sacrifice, tolerance, and peace. A Muslim who lives by these precepts in its true sense will be most polite, careful of thought, modest, just, trustworthy, and easy to get on with. He will spread love, respect, harmony, and the joy of living all around him. At this point, it would be useful to explain that Islam is the religion of peace. Terror, in its broadest sense, is violence committed against non-military targets for political purposes. To put it another way, targets of terror are entirely innocent civilians whose only crime, in the eyes of terrorists, is to represent the other side. For this reason, terror means subjecting innocent people to violence, which is an act bereft of any moral justification. This, as in the case of murders committed by Hitler or Stalin, is a crime committed against mankind. In the Quran, God has forbidden all acts of wickedness committed against mankind. The Quran is a book revealed to people as a guide to the true path, and in this book, God commands man to adopt good morals. This morality is based upon concepts such as love, compassion, tolerance, and mercy. The word Islam is derived from the word meaning peace in Arabic. Islam is a religion revealed to mankind with the intention of presenting a peaceful life through which the infinite compassion and mercy of God manifest on earth. God calls all people to Islamic morals through which compassion, mercy, peace, and tolerance can be experienced all over the world. In Surah 2, verse 208, God addresses believers as follows: O you who believe, enter absolutely into peace, Islam. Do not follow in the footsteps of Satan. He is an outright enemy to you. As the verse makes clear, security can only be ensured by entering into Islam, that is, living by the values of the Quran. The values of the Quran hold a Muslim responsible for treating all people, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, kindly and justly, protecting the needy and the innocent, and preventing the dissemination of mischief. Mischief comprises all forms of anarchy and terror that remove security, comfort, and peace. As God says in Surah 2, verse 205, God does not love corruption. Murdering a person for no reason is one of the most obvious examples of mischief. God repeats in the Quran in Surah 5, verse 32, a command He formerly revealed to Jews in the Old Testament thus: if someone kills another person, unless it is in retaliation for someone else or for causing corruption in the earth, it is as if he had murdered all mankind. And if anyone gives life to another person, it is as if he had given life to all mankind. As the verse suggests, a person who kills even a single man, unless it is in retaliation for someone else or for causing corruption in the earth, commits a crime as if he had murdered all mankind. This being the case, it is obvious what great sins are the murders, massacres, and attacks, popularly known as suicide attacks, committed by terrorists. God informs us how this cruel face of terrorism will be punished in the hereafter in Surah 42, verse 42, as follows: there are only grounds against those who wrong people and act as tyrants in the earth without any right to do so. Such people will have a painful punishment. All these reveal that organizing acts of terror against innocent people is utterly against Islam, and it is unlikely that any Muslim could ever commit such crimes. On the contrary, Muslims are responsible for stopping these people, removing mischief on earth, and bringing peace and security to all people all over the world. Islam cannot be reconciled with terror. Just the contrary, it should be the solution to and the path to the prevention of terror. In the present age, acts of terrorism, genocide, and massacres occur all over the world. Innocent people are being savagely killed, and countries where communities are being brought to hate each other for artificial reasons are drowning in blood. These horrors in countries with different histories, cultures, and social structures may have causes and sources peculiar to each. However, it is evident that the fundamental cause is a moving away from morality based on love, respect, and tolerance that religion brings with it. As a result of lack of religion, communities emerge that have no fear of God and believe that they will not be called to account in the hereafter. Since they believe that, I will not have to account for my actions to anyone, they can easily act with no compassion, morality, or conscience. The existence of hypocrites who emerge in the name of God and religion but actually organize themselves to commit wickedness condemned by God is indicated in the Quran. One verse talks about a gang of 9 men who planned to murder the Prophet by swearing in the name of God. In Surah 27, verse 48 to 50, these people are mentioned in this way: there was a gang of 9 men in the city causing corruption in the land and not putting things right. They said, let us make an oath to one another by God that we will fall on him and his family in the night, and then say to his protector, we did not witness the destruction of his family, and we are telling the truth. They hatched a plot, and we hatched a plot while they were not aware. As this incident described in the Quran reveals, The fact that people do things in the name of God does not mean that what they do is in conformity with religion. Indeed, these people may even swear in God's name. In other words, they can use the kind of language designed to show themselves as very religious. On the contrary, what they do can be quite against the will of God and the morality of religion. The truth of the matter lies in their actions. If their actions are causing corruption and not putting things right, as the verse reveals, then you can be sure that these people cannot be truly religious. Their aim is not to serve religion. It is quite impossible for someone who fears God and has grasped the true morality of Islam to support violence or wickedness, or to take part in such actions. That is why Islam is the true solution to terrorism. When the sublime morality of the Quran is explained, it will be impossible for people to connect true Islam with those who support or join groups that aim at hatred, war, and chaos. This is because God has forbidden wickedness. Likewise, it is out of the question for someone who fears God to turn a blind eye to even the smallest action that might harm mankind. Someone who does not believe in God and the hereafter, however, can easily do all kinds of evil, since he thinks he will not have to account to anyone. The first thing that needs to be done to rid the world of the present-day scourge of terrorism is to use education to do away with deviant, irreligious beliefs that are put forward in the name of religion, and to teach people true Quranic morality and to fear God. A Muslim is someone who abides by the commands of God, tries scrupulously to live by Quranic morality, peace, and harmony, which make the world a more beautiful place and lead it to progress. His aim is to lead people to beauty, goodness, and well-being. Someone who adopts the Islamic faith wishes to earn God's pleasure and compassion and to enter heaven. He has to make strenuous effort to do this, and to adopt a morality acceptable to God while he is in this world. The clearest manifestations of this morality are compassion, pity, justice, honesty, forgiveness, humility, sacrifice, and patience. The believer will behave well towards people, try to perform good deeds, and spread goodness. That is because God wishes those who believe in Him to behave well towards people, to cooperate with each other when it comes to goodness, and to avoid wickedness. In Surah 6, verse 160, God promises that anyone who comes with a fine deed will have 10 more like it. But those who produce a bad action will only be repaid with its equivalent, and they will not be wronged. In the Quran, God describes Himself as He who knows the secret of men's hearts and warns people to avoid all kinds of evil. A Muslim, therefore, which means one who surrenders himself to God, must evidently be someone who does his best to fight terrorism. A Muslim does not remain indifferent to what goes on around him and never adopts the mentality that nothing matters as long as it does not harm him. That is because he has surrendered himself to God. He is His representative and an ambassador of good. He cannot therefore remain indifferent in the face of cruelty and terrorism. In fact, the Muslim is the greatest enemy of terrorism, which kills people who have done no wrong. Islam is against all forms of terrorism and tries to prevent it right from the beginning, in other words, on the level of ideas. It demands peace between people and for justice to prevail, and commands people to avoid discord, conflict, and wickedness. The true justice described in the Quran commands man to behave justly, making no discrimination between people. God commands believers to protect people's rights, not to permit violence no matter what the circumstances, to side with the oppressed against the oppressor, and to help the needy. This justice calls for the rights of both parties to be protected when reaching a decision in a dispute, assessing all aspects of an incident, setting aside all prejudices, being objective, honest, tolerant, merciful, and compassionate. A person should incorporate the values of the Quran into his soul in such a way that he may be able to consider other parties' interests before his own and maintain justice, even if this harms his own interests. God commands the following in Surah 5, verse 42. If you do judge, judge between them justly. A person who fears God and knows that he will be called to account in the hereafter will rule with justice in order to win God's approval. In the Quran, God gives a detailed description of justice and informs believers of the attitude they have to adopt in the face of incidents they encounter and of the ways to exercise justice. Such guidance is a great comfort to believers and a mercy from God. For this reason, those who believe are responsible for exercising justice in an undivided manner, both to earn God's approval and to lead their lives in peace and security. The justice God commands in the Quran is the justice that is exercised equally among all people, with no consideration of language, race, or ethnicity. The justice in the Quranic sense does not vary according to place, time, and people. In our day, too, there are people being subjected to cruel and unjust treatment because of the color of their skin or of their race in all corners of the world. However, God informs us in the Quran that the purpose of the creation of different tribes and peoples is that they should come to know each other. Different nations or peoples, all of whom are the servants of God, should get to know one another, that is, learn about their different cultures, languages, traditions, and abilities. The purpose of the creation of different races and nations is not conflict and war, but cultural richness. Such variation is a bounty of God's creation. The fact that someone is taller than someone else, or that his skin is yellow or white, neither makes him superior to others, nor is it something to feel ashamed of. Every trait a person has is a result of God's purposeful creation, but in the sight of God, these variations have no ultimate importance. A believer knows that someone attains superiority only by having fear of God and in the strength of his faith in God. This fact is revealed in Surah 49, verse 13 as follows. O mankind, we created you from a male and female, and made you into peoples and tribes so that you might come to know each other. The noblest among you in God's sight is that one of you who best performs his duty. God is all-knowing, all-aware. As God informs us in the verse, racial differences among people have no importance. The understanding of justice recommended by God calls for equal, tolerant, and peaceable treatment of everyone, with no discrimination between them. Those who think that they will be successful by causing wickedness, upheaval, and oppression, and by killing innocent people are committing a great error. God has forbidden all acts of wickedness involving terrorism and violence, and condemned those who engaged in such acts. Islam is a religion which provides and guarantees freedom of ideas, thought, and life. It has issued commands to prevent and forbid tension, disputes, slander, and even negative thinking among people. In the same way that it is determinedly opposed to terrorism and all acts of violence, it has also forbidden even the slightest ideological pressure to be put on them. God commands in Surah 2, verse 26 that there is no compulsion in religion. The world we live in contains societies with all kinds of beliefs: Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, atheists, deists, and even pagan. Muslims living in such a world must be tolerant of all beliefs that they come up against, no matter what they may be, and behave forgivingly, justly, and humanely. This responsibility placed on believers is to invite people to the beauty of the religion of God by means of peace and tolerance. The decision whether or not to implement these truths, whether or not to believe, lies with the other party. Forcing that person to believe or trying to impose anything on him is a violation of Quranic morality. A model of society in which people are forced to worship is completely contradictory to Islam. Belief and worship are only of any value when they are directed to God by the free will of the individual. If a system imposes belief and worship on people, then they will become religious out of fear of that system. From the religious point of view, what really counts is that religion should be lived for God's good pleasure in an environment where people's consciences are totally free. The history of Islam is full of the tolerant practices of Muslim rulers who have respected all religions and built religious freedom with their own hands. For example, Thomas Arnold, a British missionary employed in the service of the Indian government, describes that Islam favors freedom in these words: "But of any organized attempt to force the acceptance of Islam on the non-Muslim population, or of any systematic persecution intended to stamp out the Christian religion, we hear nothing. The very survival of these churches to the present day is a strong proof of the generally tolerant attitude of the Mohammedan governments towards them." Killing a person for no reason is one of the greatest sins related in the Quran. In the Quran, a person who kills innocent people for no reason is threatened with a great torment. In Surah 5, verse 32, God informs us that killing even a single person is as evil as murdering all mankind on earth. A person who observes God's limits can do no harm to a single human, let alone massacre thousands of innocent people. Those who assume that they can avoid justice and thus punishment in this world will never succeed, for they will have to give an account of their deeds in the presence of God. That is why believers who know that they will give an account of their deeds after death are very meticulous to observe God's limits. One of the most important features of the morality that will lead believers to salvation on the Day of Judgment and to enter into paradise is being one of those who urges each other to compassion, as God says in Surah 90, verse 17 of the Quran. The true source of compassion is love of God. A person's love of God gives rise to his feeling love for the things he has created. Someone who loves God feels a direct link and closeness to the things he has created. This strong love and closeness he feels for the Lord, who created him and all mankind, leads him to display a pleasing morality, as commanded in the Quran. True compassion emerges as he lives by this morality. This model of morality, full of love, compassion, and sacrifice, is described in Surah 24, verse 22. Those of you possessing affluence and ample wealth should not make oaths that they will not give to their relatives and the very poor, and those who have made immigration in the way of God. They should rather pardon and overlook. Would you not love God to forgive you? God is ever forgiving, most merciful. This high level of morality that is demanded from believers, described in the Quran, stems from their deep love of God. Believers never try to make people feel indebted because of the compassion they demonstrate and the help they offer people. And they do not expect to be thanked. Their true aim is to try to gain God's pleasure by means of the morality they exhibit, because they know that they will be called to account for the morality on the Day of Judgment. In the Quran, God has expressly revealed that hell will be the outcome for those who knowingly refuse to live by the morality of the Quran. As it is understood from what we have mentioned so far, the Muslim described in the Quran possesses a most loving and compassionate nature. Nobody who possesses this morality can of course consent to terrorism or acts of violence directed at innocent people. Terrorists' characters are the exact opposite of Quranic morality. A terrorist is a ruthless person who looks with hatred on the world and wants to kill, destroy, and shed blood. A Muslim raised in the morality as revealed by the Quran, however, approaches everyone with the love expected by Islam, respects ideas of all kinds, always tries to bring harmony where there is discord, lower tensions, embrace all sides, and behave with moderation. Societies consisting of people like this will be ruled by a more developed civilization and enjoy greater social morality, harmony, justice, and plenty than can be seen in even the most modern nations today. The concept of forgiveness and tolerance described in the words, "make allowances for people," in Surah 7, verse 119, is one of the most fundamental tenets of Islam. When we look at the history of Islam, the way that Muslims have translated this important feature of the Quranic morality into the life of society can be seen quite clearly. Muslims have always brought with them an atmosphere of freedom and tolerance wherever they have gone. They have enabled people whose religions, languages, and cultures are completely different from one another to live together in peace and harmony under one roof, and provided peace and harmony for its own members. One of the most important reasons for the centuries-long existence of the Ottoman Empire, which spread over an enormous region, was the atmosphere of tolerance and understanding that Islam brought with it. Muslims who have been known for their tolerant and loving natures for centuries have always been the most compassionate and just of people. Within this multinational structure, all ethnic groups have been free to live according to their own religions and their own rules. True tolerance can only bring peace and well-being to the world when implemented along the lines set out in the Quran. Attention is drawn to this fact in a verse of Surah 41 which reads, "A good action and a bad action are not the same. Repel the bad with something better, and if there is enmity between you and someone else, he will be like a bosom friend." In the verses of the Quran, God has always described forgiveness as a superior quality, and He has given the good news that such behavior will be rewarded. God has revealed in the Quran that it is virtuous behavior to forgive someone even if he has done wrong. Surah 5, verse 13 on the subject reads, "You will never cease to come upon some act of treachery on their part, except for a few of them. Yet pardon them and overlook. God loves good doers." All of this shows the morality that Islam recommends to mankind brings to the world the virtues of peace, harmony, and justice. The barbarism known as terrorism that is so preoccupying the world at present is the work of ignorant and fanatical people, completely estranged from Quranic morality, and who have absolutely nothing to do with religion. The solution to these people and groups who try to carry out their savagery under the mask of religion is the teaching of true Quranic morality. In other words, Islam and the Quranic morality are solutions to the scourge of terrorism, not supporters of it. Islam commands peace, tolerance, and mercy. War, on the other hand, represents an unwanted obligation according to the Quran. It has to be carried out with strict observance of particular humane and moral guidelines, and which must not be resorted to except when it is absolutely inevitable. In verse 64 of Surah 5, it is explained that those who start wars are the disbelievers, and that God does not approve of wars. In the verse, it is stated that each time they kindle the fire of war, God extinguishes it. In the case of a conflict, before engaging in a war, believers must wait until fighting becomes compulsory. Believers are allowed to fight only when the other party attacks, and no other alternative except war remains. In Surah 5, verse 192, this situation is described in the words, "But if they cease fighting, God is ever forgiving, most merciful." A closer examination of the Prophet Muhammad's life reveals that war was a method resorted to for defensive purposes only in unavoidable situations. The revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad continued for a period of 23 years. During the first 13 years of this period, Muslims lived as a minority under a pagan order in Mecca and faced much oppression. Many Muslims were harassed, abused, tortured, and even murdered, their houses and possessions plundered. Despite this, however, Muslims led their lives without resorting to violence and always called the pagans to peace. Later, the oppression of the pagans escalated unbearably. Then the Muslims immigrated to the town of Yathrib, which was later to be renamed Medina, where they could establish their own order in a freer and more friendly environment. Even establishing their own system did not prompt them to take up weapons against the aggressive pagans of Mecca. Only after the revelation of 39th and 40th verses of Surah 22, the Prophet commanded his people to prepare for war. According to these verses, Muslims were allowed to wage war only because they were oppressed and subjected to violence. To put it another way, God granted permission for war only for defensive purposes. In other verses, Muslims were warned against the use of unnecessary provocation or violence. After the revelation of these verses, several wars occurred between the Muslims and the pagan Arabs. In none of these wars, however, were the Muslims the inciting party. Furthermore, the Prophet Muhammad established a secure and peaceful social environment for Muslims and pagans alike by signing the peace agreement of Hudaybiyah, which conceded to the pagans most of their requests. The party who violated the terms of the agreement and started hostilities once again were the pagans. With rapid conversions into Islam, the Islamic armies mustered a great force against the pagan Arabs. However, Muhammad conquered Mecca without bloodshed and in a spirit of tolerance. If he wished, Muhammad could have taken revenge on pagan leaders in the city. Yet, he did not do any harm to any one of them, forgave them, and treated them with the utmost tolerance. Pagans, who would later convert to Islam of their own free will, could not help admiring such nobility of character in the Prophet. Not only during Mecca's conquest, but also in the course of all the battles and conquests made in the name of the Prophet Muhammad, the rights of innocent and defenseless people were meticulously protected. The Prophet Muhammad reminded believers numerous times about this subject, and by his own practice became a role model for others to follow. Indeed, he addressed believers who were about to go to war in the following terms: "Go to war in adherence to the religion of God. Never touch the elderly, women, or children." The Islamic principles God proclaims in the Quran account for this peaceful and temperate policy of the Prophet Muhammad. In the Quran, God commands believers to treat the non-Muslims kindly and justly. In the 8th and 9th verses of Surah 60, it is stated as follows: God does not forbid you from being good to those who have not fought you over religion or driven you from your homes, or from being just towards them. God loves those who are just. God merely forbids you from taking as friends those who have fought you over religion and driven you from your homes, and who supported your expulsion. As understood, a Muslim should treat all non-Muslims kindly and only avoid making friends with those who show enmity towards Islam. In a case where this enmity causes violent attacks against Muslims, that is, where they wage a war against them, then Muslims should respond to them justly by considering the humane dimensions of the situation. All forms of barbarism, unnecessary acts of violence, and unjust aggression are forbidden by Islam. In another verse, God warns Muslims against this and explains that rage felt towards enemies should not cause them to fall into injustice. In Surah 5, verse 8, God states as follows: "You who believe, show integrity for the sake of God, bearing witness with justice. Do not let hatred for a people incite you into not being just. Be just, that is closer to heedfulness. Heed God alone. God is aware of what you do." Another concept that deserves clarification due to the context of our discussion is that of the jihad. The exact meaning of jihad is effort. Thus, in Islam, to carry out jihad is to show effort, to struggle. The Prophet Muhammad explained that the greatest jihad is the one a person carries out against his lower soul. What is meant by lower soul here is selfish desires and ambitions. Assessed from the Quranic point of view, the word jihad can also mean a struggle carried out on intellectual grounds against those who oppress people, treat them unjustly, subject them to torture and cruelty, and violate legitimate human rights. The purpose of this struggle is to bring about justice, peace, and equality. Apart from these ideological and spiritual meanings, struggle in the physical sense is also considered as jihad. However, as explained above, this has to be a struggle carried out solely for defensive purposes. The use of the concept of jihad for acts of aggression against innocent people, that is, for terror, would be unjust and a great distortion of the true meaning of the term. Another important matter that arose in the wake of the latest terrorist assaults against the United States is that of suicide attacks. Some people who are ill-informed on Islam have made utterly erroneous statements to the effect that this religion of peace allows suicide attacks. However, in Islam, killing oneself and killing other people are both prohibited. In the words, "Do not kill yourself," stated in the 29th verse of Surah 4, God has declared suicide to be a sin. In Islam, it is forbidden for anyone to kill himself or herself, for no matter what reason. The Prophet reveals suicide to be a sin in a parable, when he says that those who commit suicide will be punished. As this makes clear, committing suicide and thus carrying out suicide attacks and causing the deaths of thousands of innocent people while doing so is a total violation of Islamic morality. God says in the Quran that it is a sin to put an end to one's own life. For that reason, it is quite impossible for someone who believes in God and says he abides by the Quran to do such a thing. The only people who can do such things are those who have a very mistaken perception of religion, have no idea of true Quranic morality, fail to use their reason and conscience, are under the influence of atheist ideologies, and who have been brainwashed with feelings of hatred and revenge. Everybody must oppose such actions and take the responsibility of telling the true religion to such people. The political doctrine of Islam, in other words, Islamic rules and principles regarding political matters, is exceedingly moderate and peace-loving. This truth is accepted by many non-Muslim historians and theologians. The time of the Prophet Muhammad was an exemplary period when the rights of innocent and defenseless people were meticulously protected. The Prophet Muhammad reminded believers numerous times about this subject, and by his own practice became a role model for others to follow. He clarified the attitude Muslims must adopt even when they are in the middle of a raging battle. He commanded them not to kill children and avoid touching people who devoted themselves to worship in churches. He ordered them not to murder women and the elderly, and not to set trees on fire and cut them down to destroy houses. The Islamic principles God proclaims in the Quran account for this peaceful and temperate policy of the Prophet Muhammad. In the Quran, God commands believers to treat all people kindly and justly. After the death of the Prophet, the caliphs who succeeded him were also very sensitive in exercising justice. In conquered countries, both the indigenous people and the newcomers led their lives in peace and security. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, demanded his people adopt just and tolerant attitudes in these lands. All these attitudes were in compliance with the values of the Quran. Abu Bakr gave the following command to his army before the first Syrian expedition. Stop, O people, that I may give you 10 rules to keep by heart. Do not commit treachery, nor depart from the right path. You must not mutilate, neither kill a child or aged man or woman. Do not destroy a palm tree, nor burn it with fire, and do not cut any fruitful tree. You must not slay any of the flock or herds or the camels, save for your subsistence. You are likely to pass by people who have devoted their lives to monastic services. Leave them to that to which they have devoted their lives. You are likely, likewise, to find people who will present to you meals of many kinds. You may eat, but do not forget to mention the name of Allah. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who succeeded Abu Bakr, was famous for the way he exercised justice. He made contracts with the indigenous people of the conquered countries. Each one of these contracts proved to be an example of tolerance and justice. For instance, in his declaration granting protection to Christians in Jerusalem and Lod, he ensured that churches would not be demolished and guaranteed that Muslims would not worship in churches in groups. Umar granted the same conditions to the Christians in Bethlehem. During the conquest of Madain, the declaration of protection given to the Nestorian patriarch Ishoyab III again guaranteed that churches would not be demolished and that no building would be converted into a house or a mosque. The letter written by the patriarch to the bishop of Persia after the conquest is most striking in the sense that it depicts the tolerance and compassion shown by Muslim rulers to the book of people in the words of a Christian. The Arabs, to whom God has given all this time the government of the world, do not persecute the Christian religion. Indeed, they favor it, honor our priests and the saints of the Lord, and confer benefits on churches and monasteries. The vast majority of Muslim administrators who have reigned over the Muslim lands throughout history continued to treat the members of other religions with the utmost tolerance and respect. Within the borders of all Islamic states, both Jews and Christians lived in safety and enjoyed freedom. The reign of the Seljuk Turks and that of the Ottoman Empire were also marked by the just and tolerant outlook of Islam. Malik Shah, the ruler of the Islamic Seljuk Empire during its brightest age, approached the people in the conquered lands with great tolerance and compassion, and thus was remembered with respect and loved by them. All objective historians refer to the justice and tolerance of Malik Shah in their works. His tolerance also kindled feelings of love towards him in the hearts of the people of the book. For this reason, unprecedented in history, many cities came under Malik Shah's rule of their own free will. The false assertion that people in conquered countries converted to Islam under threat has also been disproved by Western researchers, and the justice and tolerant attitude of Muslims has been confirmed. The statement of historians reveal that Muslim administrators who truly adopted the morality of the Islam always ruled with tolerance, compassion, and justice. Likewise, the history of the Ottoman Empire, which ruled lands on 3 continents for centuries, abounds with examples of tolerance. The way the Jews settled in Ottoman lands during the time of Sultan Bayazid II, after being subjected to massacres and exile in the Catholic kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, is a fine example of the tolerance that Islamic morality brings with it. The Catholic monarchs who ruled much of Spain at the time brought grave pressure to bear on the Jews who had formerly lived in peace under Muslim rule in Andalusia. While Muslims, Christians, and Jews were able to live side by side in peace in Andalusia, the Catholic monarchs tried to force the whole country to become Christian and declared war on the Muslims while oppressing the Jews. As a result, the last Muslim ruler in the Granada region of southern Spain was overthrown in 1492. Muslims were subjected to terrible slaughter, and those Jews who refused to change their religion were sent into exile. One group of these Jews without a homeland sought shelter in the Ottoman Empire, and the state allowed them to do so. The Ottoman fleet under the command of Kemal Reis brought the exiled Jews and those Muslims who had survived the slaughter to the land of the Ottomans. In the spring of 1492, Jews were expelled from Spain. Sultan Bayazid II, who had gone down in history as the most pious believer, settled them in certain parts of his empire around Edirne and Thessalonica in present-day Greece. Most of the 25,000 Turkish Jews living in Turkey today are the ancestors of those Spanish Jews. They have adapted their religion and customs, which they brought from Spain some 500 years ago, to the conditions in Turkey, and continue to live most comfortably with their schools, hospitals, old people's homes, cultural associations, and newspapers. While Jewish communities in many countries in Europe have for centuries been exposed to the fear of anti-Semitic racist attacks, those in Turkey have lived in peace and security. This example alone is enough to demonstrate the tolerance that Islam brings with it and its understanding of justice. The compassion and tolerance exhibited by Sultan Beyazıt II applied to all the Ottoman sultans. When Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror captured Constantinople, he allowed the Christians and the Jews to live freely there. André Miguel, who is known for the valuable work he has written about the just and tolerant practices of Muslims and the world of Islam, says, "The Christian communities lived under a well-administered state that they did not have during the Byzantine and Latin periods. They were never subjected to systematic persecution. On the contrary, the empire, and especially Istanbul, had become a refuge for Spanish Jews, who were tortured. People were never Islamized by force. The movements of Islamization took place as a result of social processes." Muslims have at no time in history been oppressive. On the contrary, they have brought peace and security to all nations and beliefs wherever they have gone. They have abided by God's verse, Surah 4, verse 36, and behaved well to all people. The verse reads, "Worship God and do not associate anything with Him. Be good to your parents and relatives, and to orphans and the very poor, and to neighbors who are related to you and neighbors who are not related to you, and to companions and travelers and your slaves. God does not love anyone vain or boastful." In short, friendship, brotherhood, peace, and love are the basis of Quranic morality, and it is to these superior virtues that Muslims try to adhere. The commands of the Quran and practices of believers throughout history are very evident and do not leave room for any discussion in this matter. Organizing acts of terror against innocent people is utterly against Islam. It is unlikely that any Muslim could ever commit such crime. On the contrary, Muslims are responsible for stopping these people, removing mischief on earth, and bringing peace and security to all people all over the world. Islam cannot be reconciled with terror. Just the contrary. It should be the solution to and the path to the prevention of terror. It is not possible to talk about Christian terror, Jewish terror, or Islamic terror. Indeed, an examination into the background of the perpetrators of these acts reveals that the terrorism in question is not a religious, but a social phenomenon. The true message of a religion or a system of belief can be at times distorted by its own pseudo-adherents. The Crusaders, whose period constitutes a dark episode in Christian history, are an example of this type of distortion. The Crusaders were European Christians who undertook expeditions from the end of the 11th century onwards to recover the Holy Land, that is, Palestine and the surrounding area, from the Muslims. They set out with a so-called religious goal, yet they laid waste each acre of land they entered, spreading fear wherever they went. They subjected civilians along their way to mass executions and plundered many villages and towns. Their conquest of Jerusalem, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived under Islamic rule in peace, became the scene of immense bloodshed. They massacred all the Muslims and Jews in the city without mercy. In 2 days, the Crusader army killed some 40,000 Muslims in the barbaric ways just described. The Crusaders' barbarism was so excessive that during the Fourth Crusade they plundered Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, a Christian city, and stole the golden objects from the churches. Of course, all this barbarism was utterly against Christian doctrine. Christianity, in the words of the Bible, is a message of love. In the Gospel according to Matthew, it is said that Jesus said to his followers, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." In no part of the Gospel is there any reference to the legitimacy of violence. Thus, murdering innocent people is unimaginable. You can find the concept of murdering the innocent in the Bible, but only in the cruel Jewish king Herod's attempt to kill Jesus while he was a baby. If Christianity is a religion based on love that accommodates no violence, how did Christian crusaders carry out some of the most violent acts in history? The major reason for this was the crusaders were mainly made up of ignorant people, who could better be defined as rabble. These masses, who knew almost nothing about their religion, who had probably never read or even seen the Bible once in their lifetime. So they were for the most part completely unaware of the moral values of the Bible, were led into barbarism under the conditioning of crusaders' slogans which presented this violence as God's will. Employing this fraudulent method, many were encouraged to commit dreadful acts strictly forbidden by the religion. It is worth mentioning that in that period, Eastern Christians, the people of Byzantium for instance, who were culturally far ahead of Western Christians, espoused more humane values. Both before and after the Crusaders' conquests, Orthodox Christians managed to live together with Muslims. According to Terry Jones, the BBC commentator, with the withdrawal of the Crusaders from Middle East, civilized life started again, and members of the three monotheistic faiths returned to peaceful coexistence. The example of the Crusaders is indicative of a general phenomenon. The more the adherents of an ideology are uncivilized, intellectually underdeveloped, and ignorant, the more likely they are to resort to violence. This also holds true for ideologies that have nothing to do with religion. All communist movements around the world are prone to violence. Yet the most savage and bloodthirsty of them were the Red Khmers of Cambodia. This was because they were the most ignorant. In the period of the Prophet Muhammad, there existed two basic social structures in Arabia: city dwellers and Bedouins, that is, desert Arabs. A sophisticated culture prevailed in Arab towns. Commercial relations linked the towns to the outer world, which contributed to the formation of good manners among Arabs dwelling in cities. They had refined aesthetic values, enjoyed literature, and especially poetry. Desert Arabs, on the other hand, were the nomad tribes living in the desert who had a very crude culture. Utterly unaware of arts and literature, they developed an unrefined character. Islam was born and developed among the inhabitants of Mecca, the most important city of the peninsula. However, as Islam spread to the rest of the peninsula, all the tribes in Arabia embraced it. Among these tribes were also desert Arabs, who were somewhat problematic. Their poor intellectual and cultural background prevented some of them from grasping the profundity and noble spirit of Islam. Of this, God states the following in Surah 9, verse 97. The desert Arabs are the worst in disbelief and hypocrisy, and more fitted to be ignorant of the limits which God has sent down to His messenger. But God is knowing, wise. The desert Arabs, that is, social groups who were worst in disbelief and hypocrisy and prone to disobey God's commands, became a part of the Islamic world in the Prophet's time. However, in later periods they became a source of trouble for the house of Islam. The sect called Harijis that emerged among the Bedouins was an example. The most distinctive trait of this perverse sect, which was called Harijis, the rebels, because they greatly deviated from Sunni practices, was their wild and fanatical nature. The Harijis had little understanding of the essence of Islam or of the virtues and the values of the Quran. So they waged war against all other Muslims, basing this war on a few Quranic verses about which they made distorted interpretations. Furthermore, they carried out acts of terrorism. Ali, who was one of the closest companions of the Prophet and was described as the gate of the city of knowledge, was assassinated by a Harijite. In later periods, Hashashis, another brutal organization, emerged. This was a terrorist organization made up of ignorant and fanatical militants bereft of a profound understanding of the essence of Islam, and thus who could be readily influenced by simple slogans and promises. The Crusaders distorted and misinterpreted Christianity as a teaching of brutality. Some perverted groups emerging in the Islamic world misinterpreted Islam and resorted to brutality. What is common in these sects and the Crusaders was their Bedouin nature. That is, they were ignorant, unrefined, and uncultivated, lacking a true understanding of their religion. The violence they resorted to resulted from this lack of understanding rather than from the religion they claimed to espouse. These examples from history may help us gain better understanding of the present phenomenon, the so-called Islamic terror, which is nowadays at the top of the international agenda. That is because those who emerge and carry out acts of terrorism in the name of Islam, and those who back such acts, representing a tiny minority in the world of Islam, stem from this character peculiar to Bedouins, not from Islam itself. Failing to understand the essence of Islam, which is essentially a religion of peace and justice, they make it a tool of barbarism, which is simply an outcome of their social and cultural structure. For this reason, communicating the true nature of Islam to people is very important. Being a model to everyone by living by the Quran is one of the most important responsibilities of a believer. For the last few centuries, Muslims in all corners of the Islamic world have been subjected to violence by Western forces and their allies. The colonialist European states, local oppressive regimes or colonialists backed by the West, Israel for example, have caused great suffering to Muslims at large. However, for Muslims, this is a situation that has to be approached and responded to from a purely Quranic stance. In no part of the Quran does God command believers to respond to violence with violence. On the contrary, God commands Muslims to respond to evil with goodness. Surah 41, verse 34 reads, "A good deed and a bad deed are not the same. Repel the bad with something better, and if there is enmity between you and someone else, he will be like a bosom friend." It is no doubt a legitimate right of Muslims to react against this cruelty. However, these reactions should never turn into a blind hatred and unjust enmity. God warns about this in Surah 5, verse 2. "Let not the hatred of a people who once obstructed you from the sacred mosque lead you to transgress. Help one another in benevolence and piety, and help not one another in sin and transgression." Consequently, carrying out terrorist acts against the innocent people of other nations under the pretext of representing the innocent nations of the world is by no means compatible with Islam. Another point that deserves a special mention here is that all Western nations and communities cannot be held responsible for the aforementioned violence and oppression against Muslims. Actually, the materialist, irreligious philosophies and ideologies that prevailed in the 19th century are in the main responsible for these dismal acts. European colonialism did not originate from Christianity. On the contrary, anti-religious movements opposing the values of Christianity led the way to colonialism. At the roots of the greatest brutalities of the 19th century lies the social Darwinist ideology. In the Western world today, there are still cruel, mischievous, and opposing factors, as well as a culture dominated by peaceful and just elements that have its roots in Christianity. As a matter of fact, the main disagreement is not between the West and Islam. Contrary to the general opinion, it is between the devout people of the West and of the Muslim world on the one hand, and the people opposing religion such as materialists, atheists, Darwinists, etc. on the other. A last remark about this issue is that Islam is not peculiar to a particular nation or geographical region. Islam is the last religion revealed to mankind as a guide to the true path that recommends itself to all humanity. Muslims are responsible for communicating the true religion they believe in to all people of all nations and cultures, and making them feel closer to Islam. Consequently, there is a unique solution for people in groups who, in the name of Islam, resort to terror, form oppressive regimes, and turn this world into a dreadful place instead of beautifying it. Revealing the true nature of Islam and communicating it so that the masses can understand and live by it. At this point, it is useful to examine the error of radicalism. There is another idea that we must examine together with that of terror, that is, the phenomenon of radicalism. Radicalism means supporting sudden revolutionary, destructive changes in any sphere and applying a strict, uncompromising policy in order to achieve them. Radicals are characterized by their desire for revolutionary change and the stern, sometimes aggressive attitude they adopt. In this, as in every sphere of life, the guide for the Muslim is the Quran. When we look at radicalism in the light of the Quran, we see that it has nothing to do with the way in which God commands the believers to behave. When God describes a believer in the Quran, He depicts him as a loving, soft-spoken person, shunning conflicts and arguments, approaching even the most hostile people with warmth and friendship. An example to guide us in this matter is the way Moses and Aaron communicated the message to Pharaoh. Pharaoh was one of the most cruel and rebellious unbelievers of his time. He was a despot who denied God and worshipped idols. Moreover, he subjected believers, that is, the Israelites of the time, to terrible cruelties and murder. But God commanded His prophets in the Quran to go to such a hostile man and speak to him gently. You will notice that the way shown by God was the way of friendly dialogue, not the way of conflict with sharp words, angry slogans, and agitated protests. If you examine the Quran, you will see that a warm, gentle, and tolerant disposition characterized all the prophets. In Surah 9, verse 114, God describes Abraham as tender-hearted and forbearing. An obvious characteristic of radicalism is its anger. This disposition can be clearly seen in the speeches, writings, and demonstrations of radicals. However, anger is not an attribute of Muslims. When God describes believers in the Surah 3, verse 134, He refers to them as those who give in times of both ease and hardship, those who control their rage and pardon other people. God loves the good doers. There is no situation in which a Muslim displays anger. The only thing a Muslim wants from other people is that they believe in God and live according to moral principles, but this is possible only by the grace of God. No matter what we do, no matter how much we try to explain the truth to people, human hearts are in God's hands. Therefore, it is the duty of a Muslim only to explain the facts and to invite people to accept them. Whether or not people accept the invitation is completely up to their own conscience. So, there is no coercion to make people believe and become Muslims, or to make Muslims perform prayers and beware of sin. There is only advice. Since Muslims are responsible only for explaining their religion, they apply no pressure or coercion on anyone. They cannot be radicals, because radicalism stands for the opposite of those qualities we have enumerated. Indeed, radicalism is an un-Islamic current of thought and a political stance that came into the Islamic world from outside. When we examine social phenomena described in terms of radicalism, it will be seen that these are basically a collection of methods and pronouncements used by communists in the past. All Muslims must totally reject an angry, unbending, argumentative attitude which goes against the very nature of the Quran. In its place, they should adopt a friendly, gentle, tolerant, calm, and compassionate attitude that God describes in the Quran. Muslims must set an example to the world and be admired for their maturity, tolerance, moderation, modesty, and peacefulness. Muslims must live Islam in the best possible way and be representatives to the world, not only in these things, but also by their achievements in the fields of science, culture, art, aesthetics, and social order, and others. Explaining Islam to others and defending Islam against ideas alien to it are included in what we have listed above. In Surah 16, verse 125, God clearly reveals what attitude a Muslim must assume with regard to others. Call to the way of your Lord with wisdom and fair admonition, and argue with them in the kindest way. Your Lord knows best who is misguided from His way, and He knows best who are guided. Consequently, the concept of terror generally refers to the armed conflict carried on by radical ideological groups. In general, terror means intimidation. But this intimidation encompasses a broad field including the whole lives of people who feel the intense threat of fear and violence. But in every situation, the target of terrorism is directly or indirectly the citizens themselves. The basic quality that terror and those who are infected by its cruelty have in common is that the fear and love of God is something completely alien to them. Their hearts have become hardened, and they are spiritually ill. Terror and religion are completely opposed to each other. Terrorism adopts the way of aggression, murder, conflict, cruelty, and misery. But according to the Quran, all these things are kinds of oppression. God enjoins peace, harmony, goodwill, and compromise. He forbids terror and every kind of act that does not promote peace, and condemns those who commit such acts. Therefore, it is a very important responsibility upon believers to understand the true nature of Islam and live by it, thus setting the model for all people. In our times, anti-Semitism is an ideology which threatens world peace and targets the well-being and security of innocent people. In the 20th century, anti-Semitism, which is racist hatred felt by some for the Jews, signed its name to great disasters, one of the most horrible being the cruelty and murder inflicted on the Jews by the Nazis. In addition to this, in many countries, authoritarian regimes have targeted Jews and subjected them to cruel treatment. Fascist organizations have harassed Jews and carried out bloody attacks against them, and such events still take place today. So how should a Muslim regard anti-Semitism? The answer is obvious. Every Muslim must oppose anti-Semitism as he would oppose every other racist ideology. He must resist this ideology of hatred and defend the rights of Jews as he would defend the rights of all other people. Every Muslim must recognize and defend the rights of Jews, whether in Israel or in the diaspora, to live in peace, to worship, to protect their identity, and to express themselves. Muslims justly condemn the cruel and aggressive policies of the State of Israel together with their occupation of adjacent territory. To blanket condemn innocent Jews is not acceptable to Muslims. This would be a symptom of anti-Semitism. However, criticizing official Zionist ideology has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, since to object to Zionism is to object to an intense form of racism. There are many Jews who also criticize the racist policies of Zionism, and to label them as being anti-Semitic would be absurd. Never subjecting a community to a blanket criticism is a command stressed in the Quran. There is a need to distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, the cruel ones and the innocent. In Surah 3, verse 113 to 115, God mentions some Jews and Christians who displayed moral perfection. However, they are not all alike. Among the people of the book, there is an upright community who recite the revelations of God during the night and fall prostrate before Him. They believe in God and the last day, enjoin what is right and forbid what is evil, and vie with one another in good works. They are the righteous, and whatever good they do, its reward will not be denied them. God knows those who fear Him. Anti-Semitism is an anti-religion ideology that has its roots in neo-paganism. Therefore, it is unthinkable that a Muslim would espouse anti-Semitism or feel sympathy for this ideology. Anti-Semites have no respect for Abraham, Moses, or David, who were blessed prophets chosen by God to be examples for humanity. Furthermore, when we examine anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, we see clearly that they promote ideas and a model of society that is totally contrary to the moral teachings of the Quran. For example, at the root of anti-Semitism lie hatred, violence, and lack of compassion. An anti-Semite may be so cruel as to support the murder of Jewish people, men, women, children, and the aged, and condone their being subjected to torture. However, the moral teachings of the Quran enjoins love, compassion, and mercy for all people. It also commands Muslims to show justice and be forgiving even to their enemies. On the one hand, anti-Semites and other kinds of racists balk at living together in peace with people of a different race or creed. However, in the Surah 49, verse 13, it is stated that there is not the slightest distinction between races. The Quran advises that people of different faiths live together in the same society in peace and happiness. Jews and Christians who are mentioned in the Quran as the people of the book are people who believe in God and obey His commands. This makes them closer to Muslims. The people of the book, while they rely basically on God's revelation, have moral precepts and know what is lawful and what is not. For this reason, if one of the people of the book cooks some food, it is lawful for Muslims to eat it. In the same way, permission has been given to a Muslim man to marry a woman from among the people of the book. These commands show that bonds of kinship may be established as a result of the marriage of a Muslim with a woman from the people of the book, and that those on each side of the union can accept an invitation to a meal. These are the fundamentals that will ensure the establishment of equitable human relations and a happy communal life. Since the Quran enjoins this equitable and tolerant attitude, it is unthinkable that a Muslim could take an opposing view. The just and tolerant practices of the Prophet Muhammad towards the people of the book set very good examples to Muslims. The Constitution of Medina is the most important contract that secured justice and tolerance among Christians, Jews, and pagan communities. According to the Constitution of Medina, everyone was free to adhere to any belief or religion, or to make any political or philosophical choice. People sharing the same views could come together and form a community. Everyone was free to exercise his own justice system. However, anyone who committed a crime would be protected by no one. The parties to the contract would engage in cooperation with one another, provide support for each other, and would remain under the protection of the Prophet Muhammad. Conflicts between the parties would be brought to the Messenger of God. The contract was in force from 622 to 632 AD. Through this document, the tribal structures which had formerly been based on blood and kinship were abolished, and people of different cultural, ethnical, and geographical backgrounds came together and formed a social unity. The Constitution of Medina secured absolute religious freedom. Another important fact we learn from the Quran is that Muslims must respect Jewish and Christian places of worship. In Surah 22, verse 40 in the Quran, the places of worship of the people of the book, like monasteries, churches, and synagogues, are mentioned as places of worship protected by God. The verse shows every Muslim the importance of respecting and protecting the holy places of the people of the book. Indeed, in the Quran, God commands Muslims not to stir up hostility against any community. In many verses, a friendly attitude is advised even towards pagans. The Prophet Muhammad also made contracts with pagans as well as the people of the book. Pagans were always treated with justice, and when they asked to be taken under protection, their requests were readily accepted by Muhammad. Jews and Christians are the people of the book. That is, they are subject to a book sent down by God. They know what is right and what is wrong, what is lawful and what is unlawful according to their scriptures, and all revere the prophets and messengers that accompanied them. So there is a shared foundation from where we all can unite upon. Concerning the people of the book, God gives Muslims a command in Surah 3, verse 64, to rally to a common formula. This common formula is to worship none but God and associate no partners with Him. When Muslims, Christians, and Jews rally to a common formula this way, they will understand that they are friends, not enemies. When they see that the real enemy is the rejection of God, then the world will become a very different place. The wars in many parts of the world, enmities, fears, and terrorist attacks will come to an end, and a new civilization based on love, respect, and peace will be established upon this common formula. There are important facts to consider for Muslims. What God teaches us in the Quran about different peoples and creeds is clear. The morality of the Quran excludes every kind of racism. It is commanded in the Quran that so long as they show no hostility to Islam or Muslims, a tolerant and friendly attitude must be maintained towards other religions. It is evident that the crimes committed by some Jews due to Zionist ideology cannot be attributed to true Judaism or Jewish people. Again, a basic vantage point prescribed by the Quran is not to make judgments about people just because they belong to a particular race, nation, or religion. In every community, there are good people as well as wicked people. The Quran draws attention to this differentiation. Those who believe should never forget that there may be sincere, pious people who have fear of God among the members of all religions, as well as those who are far removed from the religious tenets. Our hope is that a world will be established in which people will be able to live together in peace, no matter what race or religion they belong to. Consequently, everyone's rights will be safeguarded and everyone will be respected. The struggle that will have to take place on intellectual grounds against all anti-religious ideologies will hopefully establish the peace that has been longed for. History always witnessed peace, justice, and tolerance in the lands ruled by Muslim administrators when they followed Quranic guidance. The practices in the lands conquered during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad are very important examples. The just administrators succeeding him, who followed in the footsteps of God's messengers and never swerved from the morality of the Quran, established peaceable societies. The true justice, righteousness, and honesty described in the Quran persisted in the time of these administrators, thereby providing a role model for the succeeding generations to follow. The land of Palestine and its capital Jerusalem, where members of the three divine religions reside together, are important in the sense that they show how Muslims bring peace and stability to the lands they rule. Indeed, for most of the last 1400 years, Muslim rule has brought peace to Jerusalem and Palestine. Jerusalem was the capital of the Jews until AD 71. In that year, the Roman army made a major assault on the Jews and exiled them from the area with great savagery. As the time of the Jewish diaspora began, Jerusalem and the surrounding area was becoming an abandoned land. However, Jerusalem once again became a center of interest with the acceptance of Christianity during the time of the Roman Emperor Constantine. Roman Christians built churches in Jerusalem. The prohibition on Jews settling in the region were lifted. Palestine remained Roman, that is Byzantine territory, up until the 7th century. The Persians conquered the region for a short time, but the Byzantines later reconquered it. An important turning point in the history of Palestine came in the year 637, when it was conquered by the armies of Islam. This meant new peace and harmony in Palestine, which had for centuries been the scene of wars, exile, looting, and massacre, and which saw new brutality every time it changed hands, a frequent occurrence. The coming of Islam was the beginning of an age when people of different beliefs could live in peace and harmony. Palestine was captured by Umar, the second caliph after the Prophet himself. The entry of the caliph into Jerusalem, the tolerance, maturity, and kindness he showed towards people of different beliefs, introduced the beautiful age that was beginning. Muslims brought civilization to Jerusalem and all Palestine. Before them, brutal beliefs prevailed that showed no respect for other people's sacred values, and which killed them simply out of differences of faith. With Islam, there reigned the just, tolerant, and moderate culture of Islam. After its capture by Umar, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived together in peace and harmony in Palestine. Muslims never tried to use force to make people convert, although some non-Muslims who saw that Islam was the true religion did so of their own free will. The peace and harmony in Palestine lasted as long as Muslim rule in the region. However, at the end of the 11th century, a conquering force entered the region from abroad, and the civilized land of Jerusalem was barbarically and savagely plundered in a way never before seen. These barbarians were the Crusaders. The Crusaders from all over Europe set out for Palestine to free the Holy Land from the Muslims and find the fabled wealth of the East. After a long and wearying journey, and much plundering and slaughter along the way, more than 100,000 people reached Jerusalem. In 1099, the city fell after a siege of nearly 5 weeks, and the Crusaders moved in, and they carried out a savagery the like of which the world has seldom seen. All Muslims and Jews in the city were put to the sword. The peace and harmony in Palestine, which had lasted since Umar, ended in terrible slaughter. The Crusaders violated all the ethical laws of Christianity, a religion of love and compassion, and spread terror in the name of Christianity. The barbaric Crusader army made Jerusalem their capital and established a Latin kingdom whose borders stretched from Palestine to Antioch. However, the Crusaders did not last long. Saladin gathered all the Muslim kingdoms under his banner in a holy war and defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin in 1187. Immediately after Hattin, Saladin entered Jerusalem and freed it from 88 years of Crusader occupation. When the Crusaders took the city 88 years earlier, they killed all the Muslims inside it. For that reason, they were afraid that Saladin would do the same thing to them. However, he did not touch even one Christian in the city. Furthermore, he merely ordered the Latin, that is, Catholic Christians, to leave it. The Orthodox Christians, who were not Crusaders, were allowed to live in the city and worship as they chose. In short, Saladin and the Muslims in his command treated the Christians with great mercy and justice, and even showed them more compassion than their own leaders had. Not only the Christians, but also Jews attained peace and security with the conquest of Jerusalem by Muslims. After Jerusalem, the Crusaders continued their barbarity and the Muslims their justice in other cities in Palestine. In 1194, Richard the Lionheart, who is portrayed as a great hero in British history, had 3,000 Muslims, among whom were many women and children, basely executed in Castle Acre. Although the Muslims witnessed this savagery, they never resorted to the same methods. They abided by God's command in Surah 5, verse 2, "Let not the hatred of a people who once obstructed you from the sacred mosque lead you to transgress," and never used violence against innocent civilians. They never employed unnecessary violence, not even against the Crusader armies they defeated. The savagery of the Crusaders and the justice of the Muslims once more revealed a historic truth. An administration built on the principles of Islam allowed people of different faiths to live together. This fact continued to be demonstrated for 700 years after Saladin, particularly during the Ottoman period. In 1514, Sultan Selim captured Jerusalem and the surrounding area, and some 400 years of Ottoman rule in Palestine began. As in other Ottoman states, This period would enable Palestine to enjoy peace, stability, and the living together of different faiths. The Ottoman Empire was administered under what is known as the nation or millet system. The fundamental feature of this system was that people of different faiths were allowed to live according to their own beliefs and even legal systems. Christians and Jews, described as the people of the book in the Quran, found tolerance, security, and freedom in Ottoman lands. However, other major states at the same time had much cruder, oppressive, and intolerant views of government. The Kingdom of Spain could not tolerate the existence of Muslims and Jews on the Spanish peninsula and inflicted great violence on both communities. In many other European countries, Jews were oppressed just for being Jews and were sometimes the victim of mass slaughter. Christians could not even get on with one another. The fighting between Protestants and Catholics in the 16th and 17th centuries turned Europe into a bloodbath. The 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648 was one result of this Catholic-Protestant conflict. As a result of that war, Central Europe became a battleground, and in Germany alone, 1/3 of the population of 15 million people was killed. In such an environment, it is an indisputably important truth that Ottoman rule was exceedingly humane. Many historians and political scientists have drawn attention to this fact. One of these is Columbia University's world-famous Middle East expert, Professor Edward Said. Originally from a Jerusalem Christian family, he continues his research far from his homeland in American universities. In an interview in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, he recommended the Ottoman nation system if a permanent peace is to be built in the Middle East. History reveals that Islam is the only system of belief to offer a just, tolerant, and compassionate way of government in the Middle East. The Pax Ottomana, which came to an end with the withdrawal of the Ottoman Empire from the region, has still not been replaced. For this reason, the way to attain peace in the Middle East is to introduce the Ottoman model, characterized by tolerance and compromise, the two fundamental teachings of the Quran. Islam, truly followed, is the solution to all sorts of violence of all kinds, conflicts, wars, and terror, and a guarantor of peace, justice, and tolerance. The program you have been listening to was inspired by the works of Harum Yahya, the renowned author whose works on political, faith-related, and scientific issues have changed many people's outlook on life. All of his works are available online on his official homepage at www.harumyahya.com. Please keep tuning in to this channel for further episodes of this program.